All right, so to get started today, we're going to be talking about landscape plants and how to choose those or select those. So, first of all, we want to select a plant that fits the space. So this photo is obviously a joke because none of you would do this, but people do this outside of their home all the time. So they select plants that are way too big for their space, way too wrong for their space, right? So obviously you would not plant that plant in front of that window, right? Because you would want to see into your house, or you would want to see out of your house. It would obviously be too tall for that space. You wouldn't even want to plant that underneath your gutter, right? Because then it would hit that as it gets taller. So we need to think about those things when we place these plants outside of our home as well. So before you buy furniture for your house, you're going to measure that space, right? When you go to the store, you're going to take some kind of measuring device to make sure that that furniture, that couch, that table would fit in that space. So whenever you're looking for a plant, think about what space you have available. So when you're looking at your space, what do you need to take into consideration? We need to look at our height barriers. A lot of the time people forget about power lines until it's too late, like this photo, right? A lot of the time people forget about windows. They want a plant there on the outside of their house that's going to look beautiful and flower, but whenever it reaches full maturity, it might be covering up your window, and then you might not have as much light coming into your home. Sometimes people might want a plant in front of a window though, so that's something to keep in mind. Do you want something blocking your window? You need to think about your width barriers. So you have existing plants that maybe you want to keep. You need to make sure you're not going to crowd those out. You need to think about your house foundation, a sidewalk, or your driveway. When this plant reaches full maturity, is it going to be blocking your driveway and you're going to have to constantly cut it back every year? And then think about how big is your yard. You need to think about the scale of that plant. We're obviously not going to plant a southern magnolia, huge plant, in the middle of a tiny neighborhood lot, right, where you only have a postage stamp yard anyways. So think about the scale of those plants and make sure that they all fit to scale, they fit to size when they are full mature. You need to think about what's underground as well. So you can call 811 to see where any kind of power lines or anything underground might be. But you also need to remember if you live somewhere where you have your own sewer lines or septic system, you need to remember where that is placed. And you don't want to be planting any trees that are going to be competing with those lines or causing those roots to intrude into those lines. So make sure you think about that when you're planting a tree. There are some trees that are better. They have less aggressive root systems for planting near your sewer lines, but in general, it's not a good idea to plant any kind of tree near those. So some of those examples might be a Japanese maple, a dogwood, even a smoke tree, and we'll show you those later. But those would be some examples of trees that would have less aggressive root systems, but they still are not a good idea. So just think about what's underground. And this is just an example of what you might be taking into account. So you're thinking about your site available. So here, obviously, we have some more mature trees back in the back. So those are providing some shade. So we might have dappled sunlight. We might have partial shade. Think about your slope. So obviously, this water is collecting here. So there's a slope around here somewhere. And wet or dry. Obviously, this gets pretty wet during certain times. So right now is actually a great time for you to go outside and look at your site. You know, we've gotten some rain lately, so go outside and see how that water is collecting. Maybe it's running off, maybe it's settling, and see what that plant might have to go through in the extremes. So we want to look at the extremes and what that plant's going to have to withstand. So light, how many hours? Does it have 6 hours of sunlight? Does it have 8 hours? Does it have all day sunlight? What time of the day? Does it get morning sun or afternoon sun? Accessibility, where is it? Can you get your hose pipe to it to water it? That's one that a lot of people forget about is watering. They're going to have to get water to that plant. Are you going to see it? You know, is it accessible to you? If it's your favorite plant, don't put it somewhere where you're never going to see it. Think about the slope, obviously, the size, and then air movement. I see a lot of people put plants directly up on top of their air units outside, even right where their dryer vents exit their house. And that's just not a good idea. That's a lot of moist air, even sometimes warm air that is moving across those plants. And those plants just in general are not made to withstand that. So think about that as you're planting something. Don't put them right on top of your HVAC units. So what happens if you put a plant where it should not be? It will not thrive. It will look pretty pitiful, and you'll be wishing that you would have chosen a plant that would have been better situated for that spot. So these are a hosta and a dogwood, and they both are receiving too much sunlight. So this is what happens, and they're just not going to be beautiful like you want them to be. So if you have a spot and you're trying to put a plant there and you love a hosta, but it's full sun, maybe you can find one that's made for full sun, or maybe you need to consider a different plant altogether. So again, this is leaf scorch. If a site doesn't drain, what will that look like? The soil color is going to be gray. You can see that here. It's a little bit starting to turn gray. And the soil will actually have an odor. It's going to stink. Normal soil should not stink. So when you are digging around, if the soil just smells a little bit rotten, that's the lack of oxygen available to those plant roots. And they have to have oxygen. So a lot of people just think that roots need water, but they also need air. So the pore space in between the soil is very important. So again, if you think your plant is starting to die, maybe you should dig it up like I did here at someone's yard, and you'll see that the hole is just sitting full of water. That plant is not uptaking it anymore. You can see here on this plant, the root system is brown. So healthy roots are white, and these have turned brown, which means that they are decaying or they are dead. A lot of the time, symptoms of drought look very similar to excess water. So this here was actually too much water in this bed. They had the irrigation running almost constantly for days at a time. And these plants just started to turn brown and die. But as we started digging them up, you can see in that front hole there, that's just full of water. So again, some people think, oh, they're not getting enough water. I need to turn it up, right? But it could be that they're receiving too much water. And then again, this is symptoms of drought. So we're seeing this a lot lately. If you don't have any excess irrigation on your plants and you didn't water them anymore in the fall, they might be starting to turn brown. So we had a drought in the fall, and a lot of those symptoms are just now starting to show up on a lot of our trees. So if you see this happening, it could be that your tree is struggling from symptoms of drought. There's not much you can do except for try to make sure that they don't undergo any other stress. These obviously are past that point. These are dead. But if yours is just now starting to show symptoms of drought, just trying to make sure it doesn't undergo any other stress, trying to make sure it receives adequate water as we go through our drier months later this year. And just trying to make sure that you're remembering that plants need water. So before you pick out a plant, you need to think about what you want to achieve. Do you want some shade, a shade tree? Do you want a screen from your neighbors? Or do you simply just want to make it pretty? A lot of the time, we all fall under that pretty category. We just want to add a plant that gives us some color or texture or blooms that we really love. So think about, when do you spend most of your time outdoors? So think about, if I want to make it pretty, I want to think about, do I want fall color? Do I want spring color? Do I want beautiful blooms all throughout the summer? So consider all those factors. And then how plants will come. So depending on their size, they could come in a different fashion. They could come bare root, balled and burlapped, which we call B&B, or container. Bare root is going to be your least expensive option because basically you're getting a little twig, and it's going to look like that on the right, or perhaps probably even smaller. And you can look at that root system. So this is best for trees, basically, and you should put them in the ground while they are dormant, so December through March. So you should not be planting anything bare root right now. You have to be careful with those roots because they can break or become damaged very easily. But you should look at those roots and make sure that if you scrape some of the soil off with your finger, that the root is white. Make sure that there's some green underneath on the top of the tree so that you can make sure that it's still alive before you put it in the ground. B&B, this is the most traditional method. The main disadvantage of this kind of plant type that you're getting is that 95% of that root system is still in the ground. So when they dig these up, they use large machinery typically to dig up these plants out of the ground where they have been grown in the nursery, and they're leaving a lot of that root system in the ground. They are not going to sell you all of their soil, right? So they can be very heavy, and you're not getting a lot of that root system. So you have to remember that you've got to be very, very diligent about planting that correctly so that it can put out more roots very quickly to establish itself. Container trees, you're getting that entire root system. So when they start to grow these, they start them very small in smaller pots, and they gradually move them up to larger pots. A disadvantage of these is that if they don't move them up quickly enough, then those roots can start to girdle or circle in that pot. They could blow over in nurseries very easily. They could have some damage to them, injury, things like that. They could also have high root temperatures. Typically, they're sitting above the ground in a black pot, and the sun is beating down on them. So those roots could heat up and die off. So you can inspect those root systems, though. Pull off the pot very gently and look at those roots. And remember, you're looking for white roots. When you're buying a transplant, whether it be a tree or a shrub or a smaller plant like this one, again, look at the leaf color. So this one's a little bit yellow, which could be overwatering or underwatering. You can look at the root health or the age. Again, make sure they're not circling in the pot. That would mean that they had been left in that particular pot for too long. You can look at the internodes, which is the space in between those nodes or the leaves. And if those are too long, then that means that it has been searching for light. So it did not receive enough light while it was growing. And you can look for pest and disease issues. So if you see some leaf spot issues, if you see some insects all over it, you might not want to choose that plant. You might want to look somewhere else. So you've gotten your plant and you've brought it home. It does not stop there, right? This is just the beginning. It's like bringing home a puppy. You now have to take care of it, okay? So the very first thing is preparing the hole. The size of the hole should be 1 to 2 inches shallower than the root ball that you have, okay? So you want to put it in the ground and you want to have the root ball a little bit above the soil line. And I'll show you an image here in a second. You want to make sure your hole is about 2 to 3 times wider than the width of that root ball. So if this is a smaller plant and the plant came and it was this large, I would want to make my hole this large, okay? You want to make sure your hole is sloped sides. So after you dig your hole, take your shovel and just hit the sides of that hole to make sure it is scored so that you don't have a glazed hole. And we'll look at some photos, don't worry. You're going to spread out that root system. So for a bare root plant, you'll make a cone and spread those roots out. And again, I'll show you a photo of that. For B&B or containers, you can score the sides, which simply means taking a knife and cutting some of those roots to break them up. And you do that to prevent girdling. You want to make sure you remove any kind of burlap or wires or cages or ropes. Those are not meant to stay on there after you put them in the ground. This is from an actual site visit that I went on about 3 weeks ago. And this gentleman found that a lot of his trees were starting to die, and he was unsure why. And he had a landscaper put in a bunch of trees last fall. And we started investigating, and this is what we found. They had left all of the cords and the wires attached to that root ball, as you can see here with the arrows pointing. They had left the burlap bag completely intact. They had not cut it whatsoever or removed it at all. And this tree was starting to die. You can start to see some tiny pinprick holes in this left photo. Those are borers. They typically attack trees that are already stressed out. So those borers probably came along as this tree started to die. And all of his trees were doing this. So he had spent a lot of money paying someone to put in a bunch of trees in his yard, and they were all on their way to dying. So make sure that you, if you're doing this yourself, make sure you remove all of those things. If you are paying someone else to do this, you can stand there and watch them and make sure they remove it as well. I would recommend that, actually, and make sure that they're removing it. And if they're not, kindly suggest that they reach out to the extension office to find out how to properly plant trees and shrubs. So, spreading the roots. This is why we spread roots out. We don't want those roots to continue wrapping around and girdling themselves. So I wish this picture was opposite, actually, because that's the way my brain reads. But on the far right is what they purchased to start with, and they did not spread out the roots at all or cut them, and they were already wrapping around themselves. They put it in the ground and it continued to wrap, and that is what happens on the far left. So you can see these roots are wrapping around each other, and they are typically what you would call choking themselves out. So they're literally continuing to get larger and wrapping tighter and tighter until eventually one of them has to succumb and die off, right? Because the other one won. So you don't want that, because then you have less roots bringing nutrients and water to your plant. And this is an extreme case. This picture is a little bit blurry, but this is what happens if you leave a plant in a pot for too long that is too small. So this was a container tree, and they didn't take it out of the container. So it just continued to wrap in that container around and around until finally the tree died because it had nowhere else to go. So this is why you want to make sure you take your time as you're planting a tree or a shrub or anything for that matter to loosen that root ball up. So this is what that means. You can score the root ball with a knife, depending on how big that plant is. You might need a larger knife. I've taken very large knives and cut through some root balls before. And so depending on how big that root system is and how much is already wrapping, it might depend on what size knife you need or how you need to go about this. If it's something simple, you can just rake through the roots with your fingers like this, kind of like you were combing my hair, right? So think about that. So you don't want any roots to be wrapping around each other when you put them in the ground. So this is an image of an incorrect planting on the left and a correct planting on the right. On the left here, they left the burlap bag and the wires all intact. They didn't even take the plant tag off. They have branches that are crossing each other and rubbing. They have mulch piled up on the trunk. You can see that there. On the right, they dug the hole 2 times wider. I would dig it a little bit wider, but that's about 2 times wider. They have the mulch on top of the soil, but not on the trunk itself. They removed half of the burlap bag, which, depending on how big this tree was, might have been all that they could get off. But try to remove as much of that burlap bag as you can. If you're going to stake a tree, say it's a very large tree and it's just falling all over the place, if you're going to stake a tree, you do not want that stake constantly pulling pressure on that tree. So you can see here that stake is just driven straight into the ground, and it has something that is just holding it. So it's kind of like a training wheel. A training wheel should not, on a bike, should not constantly be touching the ground. It should just be there if it wobbles. So that's basically what you're trying to do. You're trying to put a circle or a holding system up in case the wind comes and it tries to blow over, it will just catch it. It's not constantly tied directly to the tree tightly. So if you had a bare root tree, this is how you would make that soil cone and spread out the root system all the way around that cone. So you dig your hole, you build a cone of soil in the center, You place the tree there and spread out the roots, and then you fill back in with that same soil. And this is what that looks like in person. When you backfill the hole, you don't want to use any amendments. So you don't want to use a big bag of potting soil to throw into your hole with your tree. So if you dig out the soil from a certain area and it's all clay, just break it up as much as possible, and you're going to put that same clay back. I promise you, we can grow trees pretty well here in Tennessee, and then they're all growing in clay as well. Okay, so they can handle it. If soil amendments are used, what's going to happen is it's going to create its own little pot. You've now created a pot made out of our clay here in Tennessee in the soil. So it would be the same thing as you leaving them in a container or a pot outside of the ground. What happens? They would continue to wrap in there. So they're not going to try to get into our clay soil. They would just try to continue wrapping in the potting soil that you put in the ground. Here's another photo. This is probably my favorite for trying to teach people how to plant correctly. You can find this online. It's just called Specifications for Planting Trees and Shrubs in the Southeastern U.S. And it's by Dr. Gilman from the University of Florida. And you can see here they've got a tree, they have a root ball, they've put it in the ground about 10% above grade. I always say 1 to 2 inches because people are not good with percentages here in Tennessee, and that's okay. You want to backfill with the same soil. They have done that here. Remember, you dig the hole that wide, but you backfill with the same soil. They put mulch above the ground there, and it's just meeting the root ball. You don't want to put it directly on top of the trunk. The mulch is there simply to maintain the correct temperature and moisture. You're not trying to cover up the trunk with that. It's for the roots, not the trunk. The irrigation, the water is going directly onto the root ball. It is not spraying all over the leaves. It's not spraying up in the air. It's spraying directly onto the soil because that's how plants uptake water, is through the soil, right? We know that, but we forget that when we start to water. We just spray the air and hope it lands on the leaves and somehow the tree gets the water. That's not what we want to do. We want to make sure that we are watering the soil. And how much do we water? So for a newly planted tree or shrub, you want to measure the caliper. So that is the width of that tree trunk or shrubs, about 12 inches off of the ground. So a foot above the ground, measure the trunk. And if it is less than 2 inches, you're going to water daily for 2 weeks at first. After your 2 weeks, you're going to water every other day. After that, for 2 more months, you're going to water weekly. Okay, so that is a long time. People think that they can just put a plant in the ground and water it, whenever, but this is a lot of watering and responsibility. So again, think of it like a new puppy that you brought home and you're taking care of it. And if it is a tiny little caliper, if it's this big, less than 2 inches, again, you're watering daily for 2 weeks. So that's how often, but how much? Down here, I have it underlined. You apply 2 to 3 gallons per inch of trunk caliper. So if we had a 2-inch trunk caliper, which again is 12 inches off the ground, 2 inches, then we would water 4 to 6 gallons every day for 2 weeks. That's a lot of water, right? So think about that. If you forget all of that I just said, you can look at what Minnesota says. And they said 1/4 to 1/3 of the volume of the container it came out of. Okay, so if you brought home this plant and this was the container it came out of, think about 1/4 of that, right? And you do that daily for 2 weeks. So that's a little bit less than what our friends in Florida said. But at least you're watering it. So just try to remember 2 to 3 gallons per inch of trunk diameter. That's all you need to remember. So do we add fertilizer? No, we do not fertilize our trees. You can fertilize your lawn, and yes, the tree will somewhat take some of that up, but we do not fertilize trees. Why? Because trees make their own food through photosynthesis. Remember that with the leaves? That's what they're doing. That's why they have leaves, so that they can make their own food. So that's why we don't add fertilizer. They should be independent, making their own food. And there's no benefit to fertilizing, so you're wasting your money. So we don't want to do that. You can read that in UT publication 574. There's a whole publication on that, why we do not fertilize our trees. Also, most of our root system in our trees is in the upper 12 inches of soil. So I know a lot of people think that our roots for our trees are just going down the same as the tree on top of the soil, right? Isn't that image what we've learned our entire lives? That's not exactly true. Most of those branches are extending way over the soil, right? We could have a 50-foot tall tree, but most of those roots would actually be in the top foot of soil. Post-planting, mulching. 2 to 3 inches is all that you need. You do not need to apply a big old pile of mulch this tall up on top of your tree trunk. Mulching is just to prevent weedy growth, to help with your moisture retention, and for the water to infiltrate down into the soil instead of just running away, because it holds on to moisture. You do not use black plastic. We do not recommend black plastic for anything, basically, except for growing strawberries. We're not going to use black plastic in our landscaping. Black plastic just keeps water from infiltrating into the soil. It keeps weeds from growing just on top, right? Your weed is going to be still growing there if you have black plastic. It's just going to be growing in the mulch on top. Have you ever seen a weed not grow somewhere? No, they can grow anywhere they want to, and they will, whether you put black plastic down or not. So we do not recommend black plastic for anything in your landscaping at all. Tree wraps. We don't really want to do these unless they are necessary. And if we do, again, remember a tree wrap is like training wheels. We want to remove it within 1 year. We wouldn't leave the training wheels on our kid's bicycle until they were 15 years old, right? We also want to remove the tree stakes or wraps or anything like that within 1 year. And again, that publication 574 has more information on that and studies that they've done and the research that they found. So now we're going to get into actually choosing a plant, the fun part, where you get to look at beautiful plants. Before we do that, I want to tell you a warning. Do not plant a Leyland cypress, a Bradford pear, a rose, or an ash tree in our area. Why? Because those are the trees that come into my office all the time. I looked at 40 Leyland cypress photos yesterday. Okay, so just a warning, do not plant them. You will be heartbroken. So again, this is our handout. You have this in your email, and we're going to go through some of these. So you have these. If you want to take some notes on them as we go through, feel free to do so. But just in general here, when you're looking at this handout, you have the common name on the far left. So for instance, Indian hawthorn. Then you have the scientific name. Some plants, you need to look at that scientific name to make sure that we are talking about the same plant, because you might have a different common name for an azalea than I do, or a knockout rose, right? And especially on these forms. So if you look down here on these, consider these instead, and you see the far right column that says forms, you really need to take those into account, because that means that other forms might not perform as well. So for instance, on the Chinese quince, the double take series, Scarlet Storm, you really actually want to look for Scarlet Storm. Otherwise, they could be susceptible to leaf spot disease. So Scarlet Storm has been bred to be resistant to that. Okay. We have some stuff in the chat, but I cannot read them. Oh. Not planting tulip poplars due to the new disease affecting them. No, not necessarily. There are some issues with tulip poplars, but they're still pretty resistant. I really wouldn't plant one right up next to my house. but somewhere where, you know, it could grow tall and not be a hazard in the future might be good. We'll go through some options here. Okay. Problematic flowering shrubs. We have an Indian hawthorn. This bottom picture is a little bit blurry, but it does bloom. It has some pretty little white blooms in the spring. That is why a lot of people plant it, right? But it's not a good plant for us here in Tennessee. It's not hardy, so a lot of the time if we have a hard freeze in the winter, it's going to die off. It's intolerant to cold drafts, wind blowing through, and it has a lot of issues with leaf spots. So you can see in this right photo here, those tiny spots there, that's called a leaf spot disease, and eventually it can make the leaves fall off if it gets bad enough. We do not want to plant roses because of rosette disease. So you can see here, this is what a typical symptomatic rose that has gotten rosette looks like. It has prolific thorning. It has the witch's broom effect, which is where it kind of looks like a bouquet of flowers instead of all spread out flowers, but they're not as pretty, right? You can see these blooms here. There's a lot of blooms, but they're not as pretty as a typical rose would be. The leaves also become skinnier. You can see some of those here in this photo, the leaves becoming skinnier, and they will not be the right color. So they might be very yellow and lime green, and they turn red prematurely. So again, you do not want to plant a rose here in Tennessee right now. If you have roses, there's some things you can do, and there's some articles on that we have from our specialist, but I would not recommend planting a rose here in Tennessee right now. Here's some more information I put in there just for you. So again, you have this presentation and you can read all about rosette disease if you would like to. You can control, again, if you have roses that are near and dear to your heart, I would recommend starting to spray with a fungicide treatment as well as an insecticide. So it's actually not a fungus that starts this, it's an insect, this tiny mite in that photo in the top right hand corner, and that is what carries this virus around. So again, you can control that with carbaryl 7, bifenthrin, horticultural oil, or insecticidal soap. You don't want to be applying an oil or a soap to any of your plants right now though, because it gets too hot and then we'll get sunburned. Just like if I put an oil on my skin and I went outside, I would get sunburned. So you don't want to apply an oil in the middle of summer. So what do you plant instead of a rose or instead of an Indian hawthorn? This is called Fothergilla, and this is what it does throughout the year. So early spring, late spring, early summer, the fall it turns this pretty orange color. The only time it would not have leaves on it is the middle of winter, so maybe 1 or 2 months. But it's a slow grower, small to medium flowering shrub. It looks gorgeous all throughout early spring, February, until about end of October, November. A Chinese snowball bush, which is a viburnum, and it's a spring bloomer as well. It gets a little bit larger, so you can see here how tall that is. This would be a good option even to include in a screen. So if you're trying to screen out your neighbors, you could plant this and then put maybe an evergreen behind it that's taller. But this is going to get about 15 feet tall. A butterfly bush. A lot of people may not want to plant butterfly bushes because they reseed all over the place. There are some sterile hybrids available, which means that they will not do that. One of them is Miss Ruby, which is this one right here. And this is a summer bloomer. It'll bloom all throughout the summer. You'll have butterflies all over it all the time. And it's just gorgeous. So that's a good option. There are other cultivar recommendations that are sterile on your handout. So look through those. Again, just Google photos to see what color they might be and if you like that color. A problematic deciduous shrub is our yellow or our red twig dogwood. So they are very subject to anthracnose, which is a leaf spot disease. And with that leaf spot disease, they will completely defoliate. But we do have a new cultivar available. So if you really love how this looks, I like the red twigs in the winter. That's how they'll look. This on the right is cayenne, and it's a good option. So on your handout, you'll see it listed under problematic, and then it'll also put yellow or red twig dogwood under consider these instead. So it's confusing. So I wanted to point that out to you. You don't want to get most cultivars, but they are starting to come out with some newer ones that are resistant to anthracnose. So that's what you want to look for. And again, cayenne is one of those options. Problematic flowering trees. Our traditional dogwoods, some of our newer cultivars are resistant to these issues, but our traditional dogwoods are subject to anthracnose, powdery mildew, borers. Our flowering cherry trees are not a good idea. All of them basically will eventually succumb to peach tree borer or a canker. So you can see here on this peach tree on the right, the sap coming out. You can't control that. It already has it. That tree is going to die. So instead, consider this one, or cornelian cherry dogwood. So this is, again, a newer cultivar. It is resistant to powdery mildew and anthracnose. It has a late winter flowering that looks nothing like our traditional dogwoods. It looks more like a forsythia, right? But it's in the middle of winter. So it looks really pretty, gives some different color options and winter interest. Our Chinese fringe tree is another option for a flowering tree. This is kind of similar to that Chinese snowball bush, the viburnum. And again, it'll get about 15, maybe 20 feet tall at full maturity, but it is a slow grower. And this one is called China Snow. And that is our specialist, Carol Reese, in front of it. It's just a great plant. A lot of those flowers will kind of fall off on the ground though, so watch out for that. You know, it'll just look like there's snow on the ground underneath the plant. Problematic deciduous trees. We have our red maple, which is subject to flathead borer and ambrosia beetle. You can see that here. The tunneling underneath the bark is caused by that. Our pin oak is subject to bacterial leaf scorch. You can see that here on the right. You cannot fix that once it has it. You can't control that. So that tree will eventually die. Pin oak is also all the time planted in our parking lots and things like that. And they're pretty picky about site actually. So I would not really suggest a pin oak unless you just have the perfect site for that. But a lot of people want to plant them as more of a parking lot tree, and they just cannot live like that. So a lot of the time you'll see a pin oak that is lime green. That's because the plant is not able to uptake enough iron from the soil. So if you see that going on, that's what's happening, and that tree is just not going to thrive in that situation. A deciduous tree that we would recommend for well-drained sites, we'd recommend a nuttall oak, a willow oak, or a shumard oak. And here you can see there we have the willow oak in this photo. A willow oak will also do very well on a poorly drained site. So wherever you plant a willow oak, it's probably going to do pretty good. On a poorly drained site, you know, where it's going to collect water, an overcup oak or a swamp chestnut oak is also a good idea. So just look at your site, and again, think about how much water collects there. If some water collects in that area, you might consider those on the right. If it's more of a slope and it's not going to collect any water at all, then the nuttall or the shumard might be a better option. Problematic evergreens. Again, our Leyland cypress. And here's some issues that can go on with them. We have ceridium canker, which you can see here on the right, all the sap oozing out of that tree. A little bit of sap on an evergreen tree is normal, but a lot is not. Sap oozing out of a tree means that cambium tissue layer, which is directly underneath the bark, has been compromised. So when sap is coming out of a tree, it's because the sap is supposed to be flowing up and down, and for some reason there's something stopping that from happening, so it comes out. Okay, so think about when they tap a maple tree, right? They put something in there to stop it as it's flowing. That's why it comes out of the tree instead of going down. So when you see sap coming out of a tree, again, it's because something has stopped that process from happening, which is not good for your landscape trees. Here on the left, you can see some flagging going on. That means that they do have a canker disease because that is where that sap has stopped being able to reach the leaves. So in general, these Leyland cypress trees are not going to do well at all, and we do not recommend them. Instead, we have a lot of options. So some compact evergreens listed here on the left. And this one on the right is probably one of my new favorites. It's called an anise tree. And this one is Florida Sunshine. It stays this lime green color, so it gives some different color interest to your yard. Another good option would be that dwarf yopon. That's a good option as well. But again, just look up all of these options and see what looks good to you. It's your yard, your plant that you have to look at every day. So make sure you like what it looks like. Okay. For a larger evergreen that you might be considering for a screen, a luster leaf holly is good. It's going to be a slower grower, but you can see it does have that conical shape. So that photo there on the right, that had not been trimmed or pruned at all. That's just how it grows. Okay. You also might consider a sweet bay magnolia. So that's the two photos on the left. And I love those just because they do stay smaller than a traditional southern magnolia. They have the waxy leaf structure or leaf texture. So that means that the insects will have a harder time penetrating that leaf to suck out the tissue. So that's good. And they have a pretty bloom as well. So for an evergreen to have a bloom, that's a great thing for me. You also might consider some of the viburnums as well for an evergreen. Again, there's some dwarf varieties that were on the small evergreen list. And then you can just get the normal traditional prog viburnum is a good option. And those will get very large. For some helpful resources, we have a ton of publications about trees online. Some of those are called Transplanting Trees, Successfully Transplanting Established Trees, Post-Planting Tree Care. And again, most of these are going to be listed with starting with 5-7. So 571, 572, 573, 574, okay? So you can just roll through all of those. They try to group them together. You can also just go online and look at our publications page. Okay, so if you go to any extension website, you'll typically see the publications link there that is highlighted on the screen. And once you click that, it should take you to our publications page, and you can type in that search bar that is right here. And once you type in there, you can just put in tree and click the magnifying glass. And any publication that says the word tree will pop up. So you will have thousands to look through and read. Now it's time for some questions.